Welcome to the sixth lecture in the Mid-Tudor series. Today, we will be examining the success of the Marian reaction. This lecture will be split into three parts. Firstly, we will examine a timeline of key events, so to gain a chronological understanding of the religious changes that took place. We will then examine England's relationship with the papacy and how this changed throughout Mary's reign. We will then evaluate the extent to which the Marian reaction was successful in achieving its key aims. Firstly, let's examine a key definition of the Marian reaction. Marian simply refers to the reign of Mary I. Reaction means the measures that were put in place in reaction to the English Reformation. Therefore, essentially, the term means the restoration of the Catholic Church between 1553 and 1558 under Mary. Mary's first action was to arrest notable Protestants, such as Archbishop Cranmer, and three Protestant bishops called Latimer, Hooper and Ridley. However, at this point she falls short of executing them, which helps to support the theory that the burning of Protestants was an idea brought over from Spain to emulate the Spanish Inquisition. Mary's next action was to open Parliament. Just as Parliament had been used to construct the English Reformation, for example, through the Act of Supremacy, it is now being used to dismantle the Reformation. Mary opens Parliament in October 1553, only 3 months after her troubled ascension to the throne. However, Parliament initially refused to repeal the Act of Supremacy. In retaliation, Mary refuses to acknowledge the title of Supreme Head of the Church. However, Parliament did pass the first Act of Repeal. This was an important Act of Parliament since it reversed all the changes made under Edward VI. For example, it reinstated the Catholic Mass and clerical celibacy, so that priests could no longer marry. Following on from the Act of Repeal, the Crown issued royal injunctions. This was a royal decree that enforced the Act of Parliament. Most significantly, there was a royal injunction to remove all married priests from their positions. At the same time, Stephen Gardiner oversees a purge of married clergy. It is at this point that many eminent Protestants go into exile. In May 1554, Mary opened Parliament for a second time, and once again they clash over the matter of papal supremacy. They passed the heresy laws, which made it treason to practice the Protestant faith. However, there is a caveat: they agree to this so long as there is no requirement for private landlords to return former monastic lands to the Church. There were many members of Parliament who had profited from Henry's quick sale of these monastic lands, and so had a vested interest in ensuring that they were not returned to the Catholic Church. In July, Mary married Prince Philip of Spain, following months of legal action by Parliament that restricted Philip's power. This now meant that England had a marriage alliance with the most staunchly Catholic nation in Europe. This meant that England had de facto returned to the Catholic Church, even if Parliament was still preventing this being passed through legislation. The third parliamentary session takes place in November 1554. By this point, Reginald Pole had returned to England in the role of cardinal. During this session, Parliament passed the Second Act of Repeal, which reversed all changes since 1529, when the break with Rome began. This meant that papal supremacy had now been resumed, and in acknowledgement of this, the Pope reversed England's excommunication. The burning of heretics began in February 1555, with Bishops Ripper and Hooper burnt in October of 1555. There was reasoning behind this atrocious method of execution, since it was believed that through the burning, the soul could be purified of the sin of heresy, and then achieve salvation. Before every burning, the Protestant has an opportunity to recant, in other words, to submit to the Catholic faith, meaning that it was only those who were willing to die for their Protestant faith that was sent to the pyre. The most high-profile burning was of Thomas Cranmer. He had been deprived of his position of Archbishop of Canterbury in 1555, a position that was then given to Reginald Pole. He was then placed under considerable pressure to recant his heresy. Mary and her ministers believed this would be a great propaganda victory against the Protestants if their most high-profile leader recanted his faith. Cranmer, being old and frail, finally relented and signed a statement of recantation. Despite this, he was sentenced to death. This decision to put him to death was a fatefully bad mistake. Before the pyre was set alight, Cranmer stood before the crowd and denounced the Catholic faith and reaffirmed his Protestant faith. Then, when the flames rose around him, he reached out to the flame, so that the hand that signed the recantation would burn first. This iconic last moment meant that Cranmer went down in the history books as a martyr to the Protestant faith. 229 men and 51 women were burnt for heresy over the course of the next 3 years. Geographically, most burnings took place in the South East and East Anglia. These were the regions where the Protestant faith had most embedded across the professional classes and intellectuals. In addition, a number of high-profile executions took place in the university city of Oxford. In contrast, the Midlands, the North and the Southwest were mostly unaffected by the heresy laws since they were more conservative regions. Finally, in 1557, Mary began to open religious houses. These were much smaller than the monasteries of old due to limitations in both land and church wealth. However, they were a start. There is everything to suggest that monasticism would have resumed had its restoration not been cut short by Mary's death a year later, in 1558. Let's now examine papal relations under Mary. Papal relations simply means the diplomatic relationship between the Pope and Mary as the sovereign of England. During Mary's reign, there were 2 popes, Julius III and Paul IV. Generally speaking, England had a good relationship with the papacy under Julius III, but a weaker relationship under Paul IV. Even though both Mary and Julius III wished for Catholicism to be restored in England, there was still friction. Parliament proved an obstacle by refusing to repeal royal supremacy and refusing to return the monastic lands. In the end, there had to be a compromise. Julius III had to accept that the monastic lands would not be returned to the Church. In November 1554, Reginald Pole granted forgiveness to Parliament for their role in the break with Rome, and in return the MPs finally accepted the papal supremacy. Julius III died in February 1555. This was just before the official documentation arrived in Rome to say that England had formally returned to the Catholic Church. Julius had a strong relationship with Reginald Pole, but his successor, Pope Paul IV, had been a rival to Pole when they had trained and worked together on the continent. They had differences in ideology alongside a personal rivalry, and this soured papal relations for the rest of Mary's reign. Pope Paul IV was very orthodox in his beliefs. This means that he believed that the only way to squash the Protestant faith was to return to a very traditional and strict doctrine. In contrast, Reginald Pole was a humanist who believed that there should be some reforms made so to learn the lessons of the Protestant Reformation. For example, he was willing to allow access to an English translation of the Bible. As a result of these frictions, Paul IV cancelled Pole's legatine authority. This meant that he essentially removed the position of cardinal from Pole. Then, to make matters worse, Paul recalled Pole to Rome in order to answer charges of heresy in his early writings. Mary refused to release Pole, suspecting, perhaps, that if she acquiesced then she would never see him again. However, this heightened tensions even further. Now both the monarch and the leading cleric of England were in direct defiance to the papacy. To make matters even worse, Pope Paul IV was also anti-Spanish, and so sided with the French in the ongoing Habsburg-Valois conflict. Mary, obedient to her husband Philip, joined the war on the side of Spain in 1557. Technically, this meant that at the end of Mary's reign, England was at war with the papacy. Let's now evaluate the level of success of the Marian reaction. Firstly, it is worth remembering the high level of enthusiasm for the restoration of the Catholic faith across the common people of England. There were many rural priests that were able to bring their ornamentations out of storage, where they had been hidden away from the plunderers of Edward's reign. There was also said to be bonfires lit across England in the celebration of Mary's succession in 1553. This made it easier to reintroduce the Catholic Mass at a parish level. Remember that at the point of Henry's death, in 1547, very little had changed on a parish level, so the congregation would have well remembered a time before the Common Book of Prayer and English services. It may have been easy to reintroduce the Catholic faith at a grassroots level, but Parliament put up significant resistance to the legislation required to make the restoration official. This is because many MPs had bought into the Reformation over the past 20 years, and so had profited from the quick sale of monastic lands at the end of Henry's reign and the profiteering of Edward's reign. The two most contentious issues was the return to papal supremacy and the return of monastic lands. In the end, we could conclude that Mary was partially successful, since she achieved papal supremacy, but had to accept that the lands would remain under private ownership. Furthermore, papal relations were only partially successful. It took 18 months for Julius III to send Reginald Pole as cardinal to England, and by the time papal supremacy had been resumed, Julius had died. Relations soured because of the clash between Pope Paul IV and Reginald Pole. This meant that it was very difficult to make new and meaningful changes between May 1555 and Mary's death in November 1558. However, in the final year of Mary's reign, she was able to open some smaller religious houses, showing that the final years were not completely futile. Ultimately, Mary's death in November 1558 brought the restoration to an abrupt end. Elizabeth ascended the throne with the clear intention to make England a Protestant nation. However, Elizabeth was observant and intelligent. She had seen how important the ceremonial aspects of the Catholic faith were to the common people. This meant that when it came to designing the Elizabethan settlement, she pushed for what became known as the middle way, a compromise in features of both the Protestant and Catholic faith. One could argue that this middle way might not have happened if Elizabeth had immediately succeeded Edward to the throne. It took 5 years of Catholic restoration for Elizabeth and her ministers to see which elements remained important and should be kept. Now that her brother Edward had experimented with Protestant changes, and her sister Mary had experimented with a new form of humanist Catholicism, Elizabeth had a blueprint for the Anglican Church. However, we cannot ignore the damage that the heresy laws had on Mary I's legacy. History remembers her as Bloody Mary, because of the burning of nearly 300 heretics in just 3 years. These Protestants were immortalized in a best-selling book called The Book of Martyrs, written by John Foxe, and circulated around England throughout Elizabeth's reign. This demonized Mary and her ministers for their cruel actions against the Protestants, and, since history is written by the victors, it is this perception that children learn about now in schools and the Hollywood movies focus on. Let's return to our overarching question of how successful was the Marian reaction. Firstly, it was initially very successful, because of the enthusiasm that Mary received from the majority of the population. However, Parliament placed obstacles in her way so that it took 18 months to fully achieve papal supremacy. Whilst Mary maintained a good relationship with Julius III, with Reginald Pole acting as cardinal, and so bridging England with the Catholic Church, papal relations declined under Paul IV due to his anti-Spanish stance and his long-running enmity with Pole. Therefore, the Marian reaction was only partially successful. However, the overriding reason for its failure was the premature death of Mary I in 1558, and there is much to suggest that if the restoration had taken place over a longer period of time, it would have seen greater success.